Good evening and welcome to Current Issues. I'm your host, Hesham Tillawi. Welcome to the program, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, it's going to be an interesting night. Again, we will have a subject that would probably be controversial, which is basically we're going to tackle the government. And of course, anytime we talk about the government, it will be a controversial subject. Tonight we had scheduled two guests, but one of them will not be able to be with us due to an emergency. Sarah Krishner will not be with us in the second hour. Instead, our first guest, Fred Burks, will be with us for the 2 hours. Before we introduce Fred and introduce what Fred is going to talk about, today, September 28th, is the 6th anniversary of the Intifada. The Intifada is an Arabic word. You probably heard about it in the news. Basically, it is related with the, normally you will hear about it in relation with the Palestinians. Intifada, it means to shake off, to get up and shake off. And basically that's what the Palestinians have been trying to do for 40 years now. And in the last 6 years, on September 28, 2000, the Palestinians started the second Intifada, which basically trying to shake off the Israeli military occupation of their backs. And what is going on, ladies and gentlemen, in Palestine is the Palestinians since the year 2000, have been caged inside a wall. The wall is separating their cities, their villages. Their cities are being surrounded by walls, 25-foot concrete wall. Just imagine, ladies and gentlemen, living in a city like that. They're dividing it into ghettos. And it's not that's not all. They also have checkpoints inside these towns where anywhere you go, you will be stopped and you will be waiting for a couple of hours at one of these checkpoints. It takes about 10 hours to go back and forth to work. So you can imagine how many hours left in the day for Palestinians to work, those who are blessed enough to have a job. In Gaza, 80% of the population is unemployed. Gaza is completely surrounded. No one can go in or out. In addition to that, the Israelis control everything. They control the water, they control banking, they control commerce, they control transportation, they control every aspect of the Palestinian lives. In the last 10 years, in the last 6 years, we have had a tremendous humanitarian problem in the Palestinian territories. People don't have jobs, don't have money. It's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe that is happening right in front of our eyes. Well, not really, because you don't see it. You only hear about when the Palestinians are doing something supposedly wrong. Then you will hear about it, and you will hear about it good. But you don't hear about the suffering of the Palestinians. You don't hear about the closures of their cities, just whenever the Israelis want to close it. This is what's going on. And that's what the problem, that's what have been going on for the last 6 years. It got worse in the last 6 years, as a matter of fact. My guest tonight is Fred Burks. Fred worked as an interpreter for President Bush and President Clinton. An interpreter's job is to, whenever the president is having a meeting, a high-level meeting with other dignitaries from other countries who do not speak English or choose not to speak English, then the president will need an interpreter to tell him what the other person is doing. And Fred had that job. I think it's an interesting job. It's a challenging job. But Fred did not like that job. Reason is, he thinks it's too much, the security and the secrecy demands that he had to go through. He just could not, he didn't like it. And he resigned. Fred Burks, before resigning from the United States State Department in 2004, due to excessive secrecy demands, Fred Burks served for many years as a language interpreter for presidents and other dignitaries. He interpreted for Bush, Clinton, Gore, Cheney, and many other top officials of the United States and other countries. Having participated in numerous secret meetings where the only people allowed were the principals and their interpreters, he has acquired important inside information and contacts. Fred has dedicated himself both to getting the word out about the cover-ups and to inspiring others to help transform ourselves and our world through love and empowerment. He is currently the manager and coordinator of Want to Know Info, wanttoknow.info. Fred has also helped develop and foster several inspiring communities and websites, including Moment of Love and Global Community for All. Welcome to the program, Fred.
Yes, Tom, good to be on the show with you, and welcome to all of our listeners, too.
Thank you. Fred, what an interesting job you had. I'm sure it was challenging, too.
It was actually quite fascinating and challenging at times, but I actually really enjoyed being an interpreter, so
now,
it was mostly fun.
Tell me something. I mean, I always wanted to talk to somebody who actually was there when presidents and kings and these top dignitaries talk. Do they talk just like me and you, or do they have a certain way that they talk? How is, take us into one of these meetings. How do people talk in those meetings?
Well, let me tell you first that these people are much more like you and me than we might imagine. And it depends quite a bit on the context as far as how they talk and how they interact with each other. When they're in an official context, yes, they tend to be quite staid, quite proper, and use measured language. But then when it's off the cuff and nobody's watching or anything, of course, they're just like you and me, talking back and forth.
Now, are they they're normally nervous, or are they? Do they get nervous?
I never noticed them being nervous, and my perception is that these are people who are used to being in the public eye and used to getting a lot of attention. So I don't imagine that they get too nervous unless it's a major event, and then they may. But it's hard to tell. I know that people can't tell when I'm nervous, and I can't tell when other people are nervous. Except sometimes there's little things like shaky hands and stuff. But
yeah.
I have not noticed that when I've been with these leaders.
Now you have been with President Bush and Clinton, and also amongst others. What would you say? I mean, did it ever get out of hand in these meetings where somebody would just get upset and leave?
Well, I can tell you a fascinating story. Actually, one time when I was with Vice President Al Gore at a 1995 summit in Copenhagen for the UN. And what happened there was the Chinese premier actually was scheduled to meet with Gore. I don't remember the exact time, but let's say it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Gore's office area there. And there's a special reception place and all of that. And basically, what happened was Gore was meeting in the next room, in the official meeting room, with the president of an African country. And the premier of China came in, I believe it was Li Peng, with his delegation of 4 or 5 people, and they were about 5 minutes ahead of time. Let's say it was 5 or 6 minutes to 3. And they came in, and they were rather gruff, and they said, "Where is he? We're ready to meet." And the aides there said, "Well, he'll be out in just a minute. He's meeting right now next door, and he should be out in just a minute." They said, well, you better hurry." And so we're sitting there, and after about 2 minutes, so now we're talking at about maybe 3 minutes to 3, he said, "Where is he? He should be here right now, and he should be meeting with us." And they started getting really upset. And they said, "Just relax. Don't worry. We have a few minutes yet." About a minute later, we're talking about 2 minutes before 3, this is not even the scheduled time, they were so upset. This is an outrage, this is an insult, we are leaving. If he wants to meet with us, he has to come find us. And they stormed out. I'm just like little kids. And then, interestingly enough, Gore was actually quite late. He was about 7 minutes after 3 before he actually came out of that meeting. His aides immediately told him what had happened, and you could see he was just like, "Oh no!" And so what he did,
another diplomatic crisis.
Yes, this was a huge compound too, and the Chinese headquarters were about a quarter of a mile away in this huge compound from the Americans. And Gore said, "All right, we're going. Let's go." We didn't want an international incident, so immediately everybody just leaves. And of course, the Secret Service was very upset. They don't like doing things like this, but he said, "We're going."
Fred, how did you get?
How sometimes they can be like little kids.
How did you get to be an interpreter, especially in Indonesian language?
Yes. Well, basically, I was in college, and I was actually getting sick of college, and a friend dragged me to this meeting because it was going to change his life, and he wanted to go teach English in Japan. And I only went because he was shy, and I knew he wouldn't go, and this might change his life. So the funny thing that happened was I went to this meeting, and I was incredibly excited by everything they were presenting, and the people who had come back were just so passionate, and you could see how their lives were transformed. And I was kind of sick of college at the time and said, "Hey, I'll go." So my friend who dragged me actually never went to Japan, and instead I went with this group to Indonesia and had a wonderful time living there with a wonderful Muslim family, 20 people under one roof.
Okay. Now, take us back to Indonesia in 2004 or 2002 when the President of the United States sent a delegation there wanting the Indonesian government to arrest Abu Bakar Bashir for terrorism, especially the Bali bombings. Take us into that day when you went into the meeting with President of Indonesia at the time and some, I think it was the United States ambassador and others. And take us into that meeting and tell us what happened.
Sure, that was in October, I believe. It was September or October of 2003. And it was quite fascinating. I believe it was a Friday that I got a call from Karen Burks, who is the Asian affairs expert of the National Security Council, very high position, close to the president. The National Security Council is who he consults with closely on all of the most difficult foreign affairs matters. So Karen Burks called me, and I knew her from working with President Bush before. She was the one who often would brief me on what was going to be talked ahead of time. So Karen called me, and she said, "Listen, we're going to be having this special meeting in Jakarta with the President of Indonesia." And basically, she said, "Any chance you could hop on a plane tomorrow with me to go do this?" And luckily, I didn't have anything scheduled. And just so you know, 95% of the interpreters at the State Department are contractors like myself, and so we can always say no. And I could have said no at that time, but luckily I had the time to spare, so I said sure. And then she talked more about what we're going to be doing, and apparently it was clear this was going to be quite a secret meeting. And she said, "You do have secret clearance, don't you, by the way?" And I said, "Actually, I don't," which I didn't. And she said, "Oh, a little bit more than that. An expletive slipped out of her mouth. Mm-hmm. And she took a breath and she said, "Well, can you keep a secret?" And I said, "Sure." And by the way, I did break that promise, and I actually called to apologize to her afterwards for very good reasons. So anyway, I jump on the plane. We get to Jakarta. And what happens is we have this meeting in actually the personal residence, the home of the president, not her presidential palace. She also had she had two homes.
Private
one was
home.
One was the official home for the president, and the other was her private home, both in Jakarta. So we actually went to her private home, and were welcomed into her living room. And actually there it was just President Megawati herself, and then Ralph Boyce, who was at the time the ambassador from the United States to Indonesia. There was Karen Brooks, who I just mentioned about. And then there was a woman who was presented as the personal assistant to George Bush, who had come to deliver a special message. Now, by the way, this woman had told me that she was a CIA agent. Of course, I didn't, and I can't reveal her identity because of that, but it was fascinating to me. She thought I had secret clearance, and so she revealed to me that she was a CIA agent. Of course, this was not told to Megawati. And what happened in the meeting, basically, the envoy, the CIA agent, presented to Megawati, President Megawati, saying, look, there is this guy, Abu Bakar Bashir. We have evidence here that he tried to kill you twice, and that he was responsible for these bombings of churches in Indonesia, and we have all of this evidence. Therefore, we want you to secretly capture him. The term they used was to render him, which more and more people are learning about. And by the way, I didn't know what render meant before I went into this meeting, and I was thankful that Karen Brooks pulled me aside and said, do you know what rendering is? And I said, well, yeah, to render something intelligible. She said, no, this is a special meaning. To render means to secretly capture and turn over to another country. So they asked President Megawati, would she be willing to render Abu Bakar Bashir to the United States so they could secretly take him and send him off somewhere like Guantanamo or something like that? And, they fully expected her to say yes. And interestingly enough, she took a breath and she said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. He's too well known. Basically, he's something like a Pat Roberts. Pat Robertson, the famous televangelist
Right.
Christian here in the United States, or Oral Roberts, somebody like that. So, most of the people in the country knew about this guy, and if he just disappeared, she said, it would look back to her. Somebody's going to, start finding connections, and word would get out. So she felt like she had done this in the past with a much less known person, Omar al-Farouk, who she had rendered to the United States in early times. Said, I can't do what I did with him because he's too well known. And by the way, all of the evidence they had on Abu Bakar Bashir was taken from Omar al-Farouk, who we know now could have been tortured to, admit anything.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't want to get too detailed into it, but basically they were quite shocked that she said no. And they said, well, listen, if you don't find a way to turn him over to us before the next APEC meeting, which was about in 6 weeks, there's going to be problems. And they did not elucidate. They just said there's going to be problems. And Megawati, took that in stride. She took a breath and she said, well, I'm sorry, unless the public attitude towards Abu Bakar Bashir for some reason would turn around against him, because they overall were supportive of him, there's no way I can turn him over. And I apologize, and I hope this doesn't lead to a worsening of the relationship between our two countries.
Okay. Tell you what, Fred, stay with me. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back to finish this fascinating story.
Sure.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are speaking with Fred Burks about a fascinating story that took place in Indonesia. Fred, tell me about, now, I'm going to jump ahead and then we'll backtrack. He was found not guilty for the charges that the United States wanted to charge him with, correct?
Well, he was found guilty of some minor charges and sentenced. First off, you need to understand there was two trials. The first trial, they tried to link him for terrorism, and this one I didn't even, I followed somewhat closely, but I didn't know anything about him at the time, not much about him. So he was sentenced to something like 4 years, and it was reduced to something like 2.5 years at his first trial, and all that they convicted him of was using his passport illegally.
That's it.
Had nothing to do with terrorism. The second trial, I did not know was going on, and that's when I got called in. And just so the listeners understand, basically what happened was I resigned from the State Department because of excessive secrecy demands in November of 2004. And when I did, it actually made the news in a number of publications. In fact, the Washington Post did an article on me, and the journalist who interviewed me for the piece that they wrote asked me, well, is there anything you want to tell us, any secrets you know about? And I told him briefly about the story that I just told you, and he included that in a one-paragraph brief summary in the Washington Post. So they summarized it down to just one paragraph saying that he once was at a secret meeting where this pressure was put on the Indonesian president to turn over Abu Bakar Bashir.
So now, the United States government wanted this man because of what? What did they say they wanted him for?
They did not elucidate on that.
Okay. But didn't they say something about him being involved in the Bali?
Yes, I'm sorry, that's right. They did. The reasons they were stating was that he had actually been behind 2 assassination attempts on President Megawati, as well as behind the church bombings, which are a well-known thing in Indonesia, the Christmas church bombings.
But he was acquitted of all these charges.
Well, he was never linked to the Christmas bombings, as far as I know, other than this Omar al-Farouk, the only person, of course, who had all this testimony. And by the way, the reason he was released during the first trial is because a lot of the most damning evidence all came from this guy, Omar al-Farouk. And according to the Indonesian courts, if somebody's giving testimony like that, they have to testify in front of the judge. Well, the United States refused to let him ever, he never saw the light of the day. And in fact, just recently he escaped from a top security American prison. It was the first time ever somebody had done so from this prison, and then was shot later. Very interesting.
And then they asked you to come and testify on his behalf, which you actually had done so, right?
Well, so yes, what happened was that Washington Post article attracted the Indonesian press, who was very interested. They called me and they wrote a bunch of articles. Next thing I know, I got contacted by the lawyers for this guy saying, hey, we'd like you to come testify in his trial. I didn't even realize he was having a second trial at the time. And, you know, I asked him, well, what's going on? After checking out, it sounded very legitimate. And so I went and testified in this trial, just telling basically everything that I saw happen in that meeting.
Okay. And you were actually a hero in Indonesia for 1 week, where right. Everyone was talking about Fred Burks. Tell me about that 1 week of, I guess, being famous.
Yeah, it was rather strange being like a movie star. You know, I remember going to the airport, getting ready to go home, and 5 different people like, oh, you're that guy, and you know, a couple even remembered my name. So
the Indonesian people did not believe any of these charges, and they were actually supportive of Abu Bakar Bashir.
The vast majority of Indonesians believe that there's pretty serious manipulation going on as far as American intervention in internal Indonesian politics, particularly related to terrorism.
So the question is, people don't see this terrorism that we see it from this side of the ocean. And my question to you is, do you think you betrayed your country by going and testifying on behalf of someone who the United States accused of being a terrorist?
Well, this is the big question I was asked again and again in Indonesia. And to me here, what we're talking about, I'll tell you, I am deeply dedicated to what's best for everyone in our nation and everyone in our world. And to me, when something happening that is clearly not to the benefit of our nation and world, then it is my patriotic duty to blow the whistle. And that I highly honor and respect whistleblowers, and whistleblowers actually have a pretty high status if they're revealing something that actually is hurting the nation and hurting the world, so that it can be uncovered and then corrected. And I feel very much that that was what was going on here. The United States government in the press around the world was all the time trying to make this guy Abu Bakar Bashir look as like an evil terrorist who was out to destroy the world. They compared him to Osama bin Laden all the time. And yet they had very little evidence, and they also said that they'd never put any pressure on the Indonesian government around Abu Bakar Bashir. And that was just an out-and-out lie. I had been right there, and of course, I was just amazed that they would lie like that. But while I was still employed by the State Department, I felt ethically it would not be responsible. It wasn't a big enough problem to want to come out and be a whistleblower at that time. But once I resigned, then I felt under no obligation to hold that secret any longer.
Now, what other cover-ups that you have seen while you were inside the government that you think this is too big, I have to talk about it? What other stuff that you have learned?
Well, that was the main one, and the one certainly that drew lots of press. Most of the other things I've seen were not major manipulations.
Okay.
But of course, what has happened since then is, as you know, I've started a website which is called wanttoknow.info. And just so people are clear, that's WANTTOKNOW.info, where it reveals a lot of manipulations that are going on in the government and a lot of major cover-ups. Even before I was a whistleblower, I was already becoming somewhat well-known on the Internet as somebody who was willing to reveal the truth of what's going on for the purpose of trying to create a better world for us all. And so I had people, even before I did my testimony, who were already sending me deep information. And once, of course, I got well-known like that, I had all sorts of people sending me information about what's going on. And so the website grew and now has actually become pretty popular among certain groups.
Okay.
And had been quite influential in opening people's eyes to what's going on.
Now, you have been basically wanting to get the truth out to people. And one of the truth that you are, the truth movement that you are involved in is, of course, what is known now as the truth movement, which is the 9/11 truth movement. What can you tell me? What are your thoughts about 9/11?
Sure. First, let me just mention that I avoid using the word truth because I find that truth is largely subjective, and unless we have all the evidence in, which is very, very difficult, it's difficult to talk about what really is the truth. But what I want to do is let's have full transparency in government so then we can look at what's going on and each draw our own conclusions about what the best thing to do is. And 9/11 is a perfect example of hugely excessive government secrecy. I mean, the simple thing, there's been a Freedom of Information Act filed so that all of the video cameras, which we know surround the Pentagon, which caught the plane going into the Pentagon on videotape, will be released. I forget the exact number, somewhere between 60 and 90 video cameras filmed that plane going in. And have they released the videos? The Pentagon has released only 2 videos, one which shows no plane at all, and the second which shows something you can't even really tell what it is. So it's very clear. Why do they need to hide this information? Why aren't they revealing it? Why has it taken over 5 years, even though Freedom of Information Act requests have been issued to the government?
What are your thoughts about it? I mean, I know a lot of people have talked about 9/11. There's a lot of questions about the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of questions about how did the Twin Towers actually fall. And there are hundreds of unanswered questions. Why do you think the secrecy? Why can't the government just come out and say, this is what happened?
Well, of course, because I'm fairly convinced that there was involvement of certain rogue elements within the government in 9/11. At the very least, allowing it to happen, and more likely actually manipulating some parts of it. Now, I know that sounds rather extreme, but let me tell my own personal experience. of what happened as I was watching 9/11 on that day. Basically, I was sitting there with my girlfriend. She had called me. I was still asleep because we're 3 hours earlier than Washington and the East Coast. And she had gotten a call from her father on the East Coast, and I went over to her place and we watched television. And at the time, the two towers were still up, but both had been hit. And I thought, this is very, very strange. And just that it was strange, and I didn't have any other thoughts. But then, 10, 15 minutes later, it was announced that the Pentagon had been hit by a plane. And at that point, I said, no way, absolutely no way this could have been done by terrorists. And I'll tell you why. I have worked with a number of generals, wonderful, great people in the U.S. military. They have very high integrity, very respectable. These generals have bragged to the people that I've worked with while I'm there about being able to get a plane scrambled. They call it scrambled, which means taken off in a very rapid pursuit of another plane. So they can scramble a plane and be up on any plane anywhere in the country within 10 minutes. I've heard them brag about that in my work. And I said, wait a minute. You're telling me that after two planes have already hit the World Trade Center, that another plane that went missing, and it was missing for at least 45 minutes, according to the official records.
Right.
That it was able to go into the center of the United States military complex, one of the most strongly fortified places in the world, a place that the airspace is completely secure, that we know is guarded and monitored all the time, and could go in and hit precisely into the Pentagon. I said, no way. And I turned to my girlfriend and said, this cannot be. It's not terrorists. This is an inside job.
Okay.
So I wasn't, of course, 100% convinced, but I said, this is way too strange. There's no way a plane could get in there. So from the beginning, I questioned 9/11.
We have more and more people from inside the government coming out and saying this is an inside job, and the American people having a hard time believing it, which tells me that there must be not just the government involved in it, but also the media is involved in it. I know you have an opinion about the media and its censorship. Tell me, what do you think about the media?
Well, I'll tell you, we all know that the media manipulates things. There's nobody that questions whether it manipulates towards conservative or liberal. That the media does manipulate our perceptions, and I've always known that. But I had no idea the extent to which the media is controlled until I started getting some communication from some of these insiders that I've told you about. Mm-hmm. Now, there happens to be an amazing book out that not too many people know about that is written by some of the very top journalists in our nation. All of them are award winners. One of them is a Pulitzer Prize winner. Several of them are Emmy Award winners. And this book is called Into the Buzzsaw. And so if you go to wanttoknow.info, you'll find summaries of this book, Into the Buzzsaw, that are 2 pages and 10 pages in length. In fact, wanttoknow.info, one of the things we specialize on is making summaries of the best materials out there, because in these busy days we don't all have time to read lots of books. So I invite our listeners to go to wanttoknow.info. And in fact, if you look at the top of the page, there's a topical index that starts out with 9/11 and then mass media. And if you place your cursor over mass media and go to concise summaries, you'll see a 2-page summary of this book. And when you read that and read what these top award-winning journalists say, you will find out that although in most matters there is a decent amount of freedom of press, when you get to some of the deepest, darkest secrets, they are not even touched or discussed. And we're talking about secrets like when the CIA assassinates an American. That's one of the stories that goes on here, and how it was completely shut down by the ownership. Or when the CIA is involved in drug running. That's another story that's reported by a Pulitzer Prize winner, the guy by the name of Gary Webb. And his story was completely shut down. And you can read in this book, they each 20 to 40 pages to write about their experience of exactly what they were trying to report on and how they were shut down. So it's quite fascinating to see how it all happens. But basically you find out that our press is much more controlled when you come to the deepest, darkest secrets than you might imagine.
So what's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that if the public wants to know, we can turn this all around. And it's already happening. See, what's happened, the 9/11 movement has been galvanizing people all over the nation to put pressure on both our elected representatives and the media to start giving real coverage to this problem. For a long time, the media wouldn't even touch 9/11, even though there's big questions, and even though a lot of these reporters knew it, they were afraid they didn't have the support. But once we got enough people believing and enough people putting pressure, then some brave journalists or reporters or news anchors began to become brave enough to actually break the silence and say something.
Okay.
And just recently, we saw on the 5th anniversary, there was quite a bit of coverage of the 9/11 movement, and this is the first time we had any sort of major coverage in this way.
Okay, Fred, stay with me. We're going to take another quick break, and I want you to think about once the people in the United States find out, what do you think will happen? Think about that questions. We will be right back.
Great.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are speaking with Fred Burks. Fred, I tell you what, before we answer that question, let's go. We're going to go to the phones, and we have Mark on line one. Go ahead, Mike. Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Good evening, gentlemen. Fascinating conversation. I have two questions for your guest, Hesham.
Sure.
The first is, does he get any feedback from any of his old friends in the government as to what their feelings are, as to whether they share his suspicions that this was an inside job? That's my first question. And my second question is, does he worry about, let me rephrase it. These people who did this obviously are very evil men, and if they were ever discovered, if public opinion ever got to the point where people were really beginning to find out what happened, they could be backed into a corner where they would do something really desperate. And so I would like to hear your guest's thoughts on these two questions, and I'll listen offline. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Fred?
Wonderful questions, Mark. Let me first address your first question about my friends in government. It was actually quite fascinating. I remember even before I resigned, I went in and was talking to a good friend. He was higher up than me, but had worked with me in great capacities and really liked each other and liked working together. And when I started telling him about a little bit of the work that I was getting into on cover-ups and stuff, he said, "Fred, please don't tell me about that. I do not want to know, and it's better for me not to know." And this is just a perfect example. This is a really good guy who I knew well. He said, "I don't want to know about the cover-ups." He knew there were cover-ups, but he realized if he knew too much, then he'd have to do something about it. And I really think this is the problem with a lot of people in the United States. They know there's problems, but they're afraid if they look, if these problems are too big, then either they're going to feel overwhelmed, they're going to feel hopeless, or they're going to feel like they really have to do something, they don't really want to do something. So this is, to me, the most important thing is to reach out to people psychologically and say, hey, when we come together, we're all going to need to do something about it, but we can transform this entire world to become a better place for us all. And I have no doubt about that. So, and interesting, once I did the testimony, I haven't heard from anybody at all, period, of my old colleagues. There's a couple guys that I work with privately, but other than that, I haven't heard from. Well, I heard from one other guy, slight qualification, sorry. One other guy is very appreciative of my work. And one guy called to say that he really didn't agree with me revealing these secrets because that is unethical no matter what. And so we had a conversation about that.
Okay.
On to the second question. If these men are backed into a corner, couldn't they do something crazy? Absolutely. But, and here's the key thing that a lot of people don't know. When 9/11 happened, you have to understand there were a lot of people who were involved in setting this up who did not realize that they were involved. It's complex, and to try to explain it briefly, intelligence and the military are the ones who carry out this stuff. And it's not the whole intelligence community, it's not the whole military. Both intelligence and military are what are called compartmentalized. There are thousands of compartmentalized projects where those who worked in one project are never allowed to talk to anybody about what they're doing in another project. In fact, they use something called a need to know. Unless you have a need to know, I cannot tell anybody about anything I'm doing on this project. And I myself don't even know what this project is about. So, my guess is that there were at least several thousand people, both in the military intelligence and even in industry, who were involved in some way in making 9/11 happen. Now, they did not know that. I'm going to guess the number of people who actually had foreknowledge of what they were doing is less than a couple hundred. But these thousands of people, once 9/11 happened, of course they're in shock when they realize that they had done something to help this happen. They're suddenly faced with a huge moral dilemma. Oh my God, I just helped to kill these 3,000 innocent civilians. So what do you do? Well, the whole nation and world has turned and is in sympathy, and you can't start saying this was a government thing, of course. People would just say, you're nuts, you're crazy, and, anything could happen. But what happened was some of them said, this is too big, I'm just going to go along. These guys are obviously winning and running the game. I'm just going to do what they tell me. But a lot of these people are really good people. A lot of people in the intelligence community that I know personally and in the military. And they were just super, super upset and pissed at what happened. And so these people, without speaking out too loudly, because they know that they will get beaten down or worse, they are doing what they can to stop this kind of craziness in government. And there has been huge, huge infighting going on in both the intelligence and military communities. If you read the papers closely and read between the lines, you can see some of this going on over the years. Huge, huge infighting, because too many people on the inside know what's going on and are secretly working to get the craziness out of there. And so for that reason, it is now very, very difficult for those same people to try to pull off anything like a 9/11 again. I'm not saying it's impossible, but they need too many people to pull off a major operation like that, and there are too many people who are saying this is wrong and who would end up revealing their plans. So
now,
the longer we go, the less chance there is of another major 9/11 happening.
Okay. Tell me something, Fred, about when someone is sworn to secrecy, what is the punishment?
Well, it varies. The punishment can be anything from a fine, which it would have been probably in my case, but I wasn't sworn to secrecy, to major jail time. I know around some of the topics it was both jail time and a fine. Or some in the military, sometimes it was being sent off to Alaska to do 2 years of duty in Barrow, Alaska, which is like freezing cold and in the middle of winter when there's no light.
So I'm sure most of these people who were involved in 9/11 in one part or another, and they did not know exactly what was going on, I'm sure all of them were sworn to secrecy, and if that's
Absolutely.
the case, no one's crazy enough to come out, especially at this time.
Right.
And especially that the people, the average Joe on the street, doesn't give a darn so far, but I'm sure very soon they will, especially with what's going on overseas and with what we are doing overseas. So I'm sure the average American out there will have to get in. So right now there's really no incentive and there's no backing for anyone to come out, because the media is not going to be on his side, and if no one knows about him, so I'm sure everybody who was involved in that project or found out that they were involved in that project is not crazy enough to come out, because the media is not going to help him, and he knows that the average man on the street doesn't know anything about him, and he does not want to spend the rest of his life in Alaska.
That's right. Well, it's very good points, Hesham. And in fact, I want to tell you something. There's been some key people that have come out. In fact, if you want to see something really exciting, you may not have seen this yet. There's a great new website that just went up a few weeks ago. It's at www.patriotsquestion911.com. So if you go to that website, patriotsquestion911.com, you will see the title is Senior Military Intelligence and Government Critics of 9/11 Commission Report. You'll see there some very key people. For instance, there is Morgan Reynolds was the chief economist at the Labor Department under George Bush. And here, the quote from him says, "I first began to suspect that 9/11 was an inside job when the Bush-Cheney administration invaded Iraq." And he goes on to tell his whole story. Now, as soon as he went public with this, the media stopped paying attention to him. Previous to that, if he had wanted to say something about the economy or this or that, he would have been quoted. This is a professor of economics from Texas A&M University who was, hired to be the chief economist at the Department of Labor. So, but as soon as he went public with this 9/11 stuff, the media absolutely drops him.
So does that tell you that maybe it's the same corporations or the same entity that is controlling the media, also pulling the strings on the politicians?
Well, yes, and it's complex because it's not just the controllers that are stopping this. You got to understand that a lot of people in the media really don't want to believe that 9/11 could have been an inside job. I mean, some of these people they're too psychologically stuck in their walls to even consider the possibility that there was actual government complicity, and that still stands. So that is another reason why when somebody talks like this, they'll just get written off, even if they're somebody very well known. But if these people are at least willing to look at some of the evidence, and they go to somewhere like this website, patriotsquestion911.com, where you have 50 top government and military officials, each of them saying incredibly astonishing statements about 9/11, then they'll start saying, well, wait a minute, if these very intelligent, very high-level people are questioning 9/11, I wonder if something really might be going on here.
Okay. Just to remind our viewers that in the next hour we will continue with this discussion with Fred Burks, and we will talk about different areas and interests that he is involved in, and one of them is we have talked about with Steve Lynch last week, which is mind control. We're going to talk about mind control and the government with Fred, and also another project which is interesting project that we just maybe we might be able to solve all our problems with love, and we will talk about that in the next hour. Fred, just continue for the few minutes that we have left in this segment. Is the war in Iraq and what is going on in the Middle East, what is the correlation between that and 9/11?
Well, basically what you find is that there is something that I like to call the war machine, that President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And the war machine manages vast, vast amounts of money. We're talking literally trillions of dollars go through over the course of the years through the military-industrial complex. When you have those kind of amounts of money, and you know that every one of us has some greed inside of us. Every person, this is something that I like to point out, when we talk about them being so evil and us being so good, guess what? We all have these tendencies inside of us. Hopefully we're not acting on them much, and some people do act on it much more than others. But greed is rampant within government, much more than most people would suspect. And if you go and explore some of the major media stories that we have links to from wanttoknow.info, you'll see how there is just massive, massive corruption, more than you would think. So the war machine needs to have a continual state of war so that we can be pumping and demanding more money into these secret black projects, and that's where it disappears, because the black project budgets, legally, they don't have to report where the money goes. So, of course, there are real reasons for some of these black projects, but some of the money is just going down black holes that's going into people's pockets, and it's the pockets of some of the richest and most influential people in the country oftentimes.
Okay. Now, Fred, as you know, after the Cold War was over, we could not continue without another adversary out there, even if we have to create him, because the secret to governments, either here or abroad, is they have to be aligned with somebody for a reason. And a lot of these governments who are aligned with the United States, they very much were afraid of losing that, the privileges that come with that alignment. And I'm wondering if this problem with Islam and Islamic and terrorism, if this is because so far, to tell you the truth, I have not seen any prisoners that we have taken in this war. At least we have not even put any of them through the, or bring them to justice. And I came from the other world, and I know the other world did not have anything to call terrorism. I do believe that terrorism do exist, but not in the extent that the United States has to go to war against terrorism. Was terrorism an invention of the United States, and it was supported by other countries because they do not want to lose the support they receive from the United States?
Well, no, there's no way I would believe that terrorism was the invention of the United States. Terrorism has been around for millennia, thousands and thousands of years.
Okay.
Now, it's been used by governments very effectively as a tool to keep control of people. And maybe that has been refined quite a bit by some people in the United States, but by no means do I believe it's just the United States. I believe that leaders of the Middle East and Muslim leaders are just as complicit as the United States.
That's exactly my point, is other leaders in the Middle East, basically they had to get somebody, they had to be on the side of the United States with something, and it is to their advantage to actually fuel this terrorism and even nurture it, because it's in their advantage.
Right. Well, in a way, even the Muslim leaders, so many of them want to galvanize the people against something. You see, if you're a leader who doesn't have a lot of charisma, and you want to keep control of the people, you've got to find the easiest way. I should say the easiest way to get people to support you is create an enemy, or find an enemy that you can get everybody focused on and say, rally behind me, let's go against them, and then the people will start pouring their money so that you can work against them. So it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim, Christian, or Democrat or Republican. If you're manipulating people to try to get them to support you by working against somebody, to me you're working on what I call the old paradigm thinking. The old paradigm is all about us and them. They're evil, we're good, join me and give me your money so that we can attack them. And the new paradigm is about realizing, guess what? We're all human. We're all from the same human family. Every person in this world has a heart. And you mentioned about love, which is one of the things that I actually think is very important. When we can recognize that every person has a heart that just wants, in its deepest place, to love and be loved, that this is where we're going to really transform the world, and we're going to create a whole new paradigm so that we can live in a much more cooperative, healthy way with each other.
Okay, Fred, unfortunately we are coming to an end for this first segment. Stay with me. We're going to be gone for about 5 minutes, and then we will be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be back in 5 minutes with Fred Burks. Don't miss the second hour.